as you might imagine, you can't have that big of a revolution going on south of the Mexican border, south of the Rio Grande, without sooner or later it's spilling over into Texas. And Texas assumes a pretty great importance in this fight. That's where you run to if you're being chased. That's where you declare from if you're trying to do a counter-revolution. Places like Fort Bliss assume a much larger importance than they had in the past. Fort Sam Houston, established in 1876, becomes a critical U.S. military post right there in San Antonio. It's really convinces everybody that San Antonio is a very important military hub. Not the least of which is the Army, what would become the Army Air Corps. San Antonio provides a very nice place to experiment with military aviation. And later on, you'll see a lot of air bases established there. Tens of thousands of U.S. regulars moved to Texas during the course of this revolution, as we've discussed, and includes such luminaries as a young officer named George S. Patton and a already experienced leader named John J. Pershing, both of whom will have important roles in World War I. But for Texas, one of the most troubling developments from the Mexican Revolution becomes known as the Plan of San Diego. The Plan of San Diego supposedly was designed to launch from the town down in the lower Rio Grande Valley of San Diego on January 6, 1915. And this revolution in South Texas would essentially be a race war. The revolutionaries would create what they call the Army of Races and Peoples that would then overthrow American occupation of the present-day Southwest, including Texas and the states given over in the Mexican Cession during the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848, which would include places like Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona. So there would be a new republic liberated by this Army of Races and People, and the people that would be victims of this war would be all white males over the age of 16. No quarter. So essentially this is genocide declared in South Texas against whites in an effort to create a new republic. In July of 1915, when it was supposed to launch in January, doesn't quite launch. The local law officials are on the lookout. There's a couple of shots exchanged. But by July of 1915, there's kind of a pattern of violence that is occurring in the lower Rio Grande Valley. There's an estimated 30 cross-border raids between Mexico and into Texas. And all of it appears to be supported, at least tacitly, by President Carranza of Mexico. So Carranza is supposed to be the Americans' guy, but he's not acting like it. In these raids, 21 Americans are killed on American soil, and more than 300 Mexicans and Mexican Americans are killed at the same time. Well, the United States government clearly needs help. Governor James E. Ferguson essentially calls on the Texas Rangers to once again be a Texas Army that will help the state defend its borders. The regular Texas Ranger Force that we talked about some lessons ago is now supplemented by hundreds of special rangers, essentially a militia. And this militia is not particularly careful about its techniques. And there's a lot of brutality that is visited upon the Mexican and the Mexican-American populations of the Rio Grande Valley. It's estimated that the Texas Rangers and the Special Rangers, this expanded force, accounted for more than 5,000 deaths, that they killed 5,000 people in the process of securing the U.S.-Mexico border, the Texas-Mexico border. And ultimately, it is these crimes and these excesses, these brutal massacres that discredit the Texas Rangers in a way that had never been discredited before. And in fact, there are some Texas lawmakers that threaten to disband the Rangers once and for all because of this. Well, while Texas is patrolling its border and trying to secure its the crossings into Mexico, both going in and coming out, the United States Army finds itself getting wrapped up in a fight with Pancho Villa. See, Pancho Villa blames the United States for his being eclipsed, for backing Carranza. And so in 1916, Villa strikes back. It's actually in January 9th, 1916, that Villistas stop a train that has a number of American mining engineers aboard, hauls them all off at a little place called San Isabel, lines them up and shoots them. Just mows them down. Just, you're an American? Yeah. Bam, you're done. That causes all sorts of shockwaves through the U.S. Then on March 9th, 1916, Villistas cross over into southern New Mexico and attack the town of Columbus and its small American military garrison there. They tear up the town, burn it down. U.S. troops chase the raiders back across the border, but there's a pretty sizable loss of life and certainly loss of property. At any rate, this is an invasion. There's another cross-border raid over into Texas at Glen Springs, down in the Big Bend country. Villistas raid an isolated ranch down there. And this seems to be a growing pattern in 15 and 16, so Woodrow Wilson mobilizes the United States National Guard and sends 117,000 National Guardsmen to the U.S.-Mexican border. Well, on June 15th, 1916, there's another skirmish at San Ignacio, Texas. And this ends up becoming just more than the federal government can bear, all this giving and taking. So the United States mobilizes specifically against Villa, and in doing so is actually becoming an agent of the Carranza government, but the Carranza government is turning a blind eye to the violence associated with the Plan of San Diego. So it's hard to tell who the good guys and the bad guys are. But the United States launches what is known as the Pershing expedition into Mexico in March of 1916, and it kind of putters along until early in 1917. 12,000 U.S. troops invade Chihuahua. There's a couple of pretty significant fights, one in the small town of Parral, another one at El Carrizal. Parral's in April, Carrizal's in June. These are skirmishes, company-level fights. Sometimes the Americans come off looking pretty good. Sometimes they come off looking pretty bad. But they're fighting Carranza's troops in Chihuahua and not Villa's. Well, the reason they're fighting Carranza's troops is because Carranza is the recognized government. Remember, we recognized that government. And so we're rewarded for that recognition by that government opposing this invasion of their territory while U.S. troops are trying to wipe out Carranza's opponent, Villa. I don't get it, but that's kind of how it all went down. They fail, they come back. All right. Villa, unchastened and unchastised, then is free to operate against Carranza and absolutely wipes out a Carrancista garrison at, say it with me, Ojinaga. And the survivors of the Carrancista garrison, these are now by definition federales, all run over into Texas once again. Villa presses his luck. He fights at Chihuahua, but is horribly mauled. Retreats back to Juarez, and in June of 1917, he fights at Ojinaga in May 1917. By June of 1917, he's pinned down in Juarez. The U.S. troops over in Fort Bliss brush him out of Juarez, essentially nudge him out so he can be pursued by the Carranza troops, and Villa's army tends to scatter. Some of these guys are so used to living by plundering and raiding that they continue to plunder and raid over on the Texas side of the border. The most notorious incident being the Bright Ranch raid on Christmas of 1917. Texas Rangers retaliate with what is known as the Porvenir Massacre shortly thereafter. The Villistas retaliate with the Neville Ranch raid on March 25th, 1918, there's this giving and taking that's going on, and it's a violent place, the Texas-Mexican border. Finally, by 1919, there's a number of things that have ceased. The war in Europe is over. World War I ends in 1918, and the Mexican Revolution seems to be simmering down about the same time. Certainly by 1919, the border is much more peaceful than it had been.